Welcome, John Robson.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to see you once again, John. John is a PhD in American history, graduate of, I guess, Texas State University in Austin.
University of Texas at
University
Austin,
of Texas,
So Longhorns.
And also publishes columns in the National Post and the Post media chain. Been well known through Canadian publishing circles and media circles, and now is also executive director of the Climate Change Nexus.
Climate Discussion Nexus.
Climate Discussion Nexus.
Yep, climatediscussionnexus.com, folks.
Okay. Well, listen, I'm sure you're going to enjoy listening to this conversation. John brings a wealth of information. We're going to talk today about our fundamental freedoms during COVID, the rule of law, and those foundational concepts of Western liberal society. And what we're seeing today throughout the Western world, certainly in Canada, many parts of the Western world, how we've disregarded all those foundational values. So maybe I'll start with this question, John. Maybe if just give us your thoughts, your insights into those foundational concepts of Western society, the rule of law, fundamental freedoms of expression, mobility, and why they're so important to us.
The foundational value really is freedom. People nowadays in Canada, they think you're in the wrong country if you say that. But remember Wilfrid Laurier said, Canada is free and freedom is its nationality. And this is looking back a long way through our history, by which I mean the history of Britain, back to Magna Carta. And Magna Carta is itself a conservative document. Magna Carta is imposed upon a king by a group of barons and clerics. I mean, it was actually drafted largely by Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, because the king was trying to take away liberties that had existed from time immemorial. And people were unwilling to have this happen because they knew that without freedom, you have no dignity, not in some abstract sense, but that you're pushed around, you are robbed, you are imprisoned without cause, you're afraid to speak your mind. And down through the centuries, it's extraordinary how free England was. Again, people don't tend to think of England as free, but you look at Land of Hope and Glory, and it describes Britain as mother of the free.
Right.
And all these things about a man's home being his castle, and it may be ever so frail, and the wind may enter and the storm may enter, but the King of England may not enter. This is how the English-speaking people, wherever they lived, understood themselves. And so when the Americans revolt in 1776, they didn't say, hey, you know what, it'd be nice to be free for a change. What they said is, our English liberties are being taken away by a usurping tyrant king, and we will have none of it. We will stand on the rights of Englishmen. We look to Magna Carta. In fact, if you look at this seal of Massachusetts from 1775, it's a guy looking like he's suiting up for the New England Patriots logo shoot, but he's got a sword in one hand and a scroll in the other. And if you look closely, the scroll says Magna Charta. And again, you look at the Confederation debates in Canada, now that we finally got them published, and what you have is one group of people saying, preserve your British liberty, join Confederation, and other people saying, preserve your British liberty, don't join Confederation. You don't have people saying, oh, freedom is for losers or freedom is for Americans.
Right.
And this is because people understood it's not just a matter that you yourself will not be subjected to oppression, but also that freedom is how you solve problems in society. When something is wrong, people talk about it. They discuss it. They say, what should we do? They have the right to gather and say, we're going to have a meeting. We're going to talk about this. And we don't care if you want us to talk about it or not. We're going to talk about it. We're going to discuss ideas. We're going to understand. We're going to hear from other points of view. Because the government, of course, always thinks it's doing a great job, right? When you listen to any politician, except possibly you, but anyone else, you ask them, how are you doing? Oh, we're doing wonderfully, the throne speech. We haven't made a mistake since we were 7. And we're all prone to the sin of pride, but most of us can't shut up our critics. And in the English-speaking world, the rulers couldn't shut up their critics.
That's an important, couldn't shut up our critics. And we see just recently, last week in Ontario, where the Ford administration has outlawed the public gatherings of more than 25 people outdoors or 10 people indoors. And I was just astonished, not only that this came out, but it took effect immediately. It didn't take effect with debate and discussion and vote in the legislature. It was just an arbitrary decision made that took effect. And I have never, in my life in politics, ever seen a law that took effect immediately.
And interestingly enough, that it's actually a very old quarrel about whether or not the king, or in this case now it's the first minister, whether their word is law. Yeah. And in fact, Richard II was deposed and then sort of disappeared because, among other things, he said, the law is in my mouth. He said, the word of the king is law. And everybody else just about said, no, law in England is above the ruler, not the other way around. Right. And you see this, and Henry VIII actually tried to get Parliament to agree that his word was law. Yeah. And he put this very scary bill in front of them. And Henry VIII was a scary guy, not just, if you're walking up the aisle with him, he's just period scary. But Parliament said, well, okay, yeah, your world is law, except in anything that touches our ancient rights, liberties, privileges, or habits. And so now you see it, now you don't. They wouldn't give him that power. Right. But increasingly now, legislation says, well, the minister can do what they like. Yeah. There was even one British statute that said the minister can change the law if he wants. And amazing. And what's remarkable is that it didn't cause much of an outcry. We're not surprised anymore that the premier just says, I hereby ban gatherings. Yeah. And that's how things are. Yeah. And then you think, well, what we need to do is we need to elect somebody else who will have the same power. Yeah. No, we need to stop government from having the power to infringe things like free assembly and free speech just by saying so. Yeah. And the thing is, sometimes people think of freedom as kind of a luxury. Like, if nothing's going on, sure, be free, yap, all you want, silly man. But, when you got a crisis, you got to get with the program. Yeah, yeah. And they also think, well, if we're free, we can't act in emergencies. And therefore, we must give up our freedom. But that's not true. And Britain's a good example. In World War I, which wasn't going the way anybody'd hoped, and then you're sort of like, because the Germans were winning it and it was taking forever. In 1915, there was a scandal over bad munitions. Yeah. And you could imagine people saying, hey, don't tell the Germans our shells stink, right? No, this isn't the moment. But other people said, look, we got two choices here. We either fight the war with bad shells and lose it, or we have a really embarrassing discussion and fix the problem. It ended up bringing down the prime minister, but they fixed the problem and they won the war. Right. And in Germany, nobody was going around saying, you know what, the Kaiser's a bozo and our plan is stupid. And this was a terrible weakness in the German war effort, is that it went uncriticized. Yeah.
So the absence of freedom was the solution. Was the harmful, the loss. The freedom allows proper discussion and the resolution of what fails.
And in carnage and culture, Victor Davis Hanson takes this all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Yeah. And this pivotal showdown at Salamis between the invading Persians and the Greeks, before almost any of the classical Socrates, Plato stuff you've heard of, the dawn of real freedom. And the Persians have a much more impressive army and a much more impressive fleet, and they've got this semi-divine king and ranks of spears. And the Greeks are squabbling and arguing and insulting each other the whole way, bickering in the tent the night before the battle. But on the morning of the battle, they'd found the right plan and the Persians hadn't. Yeah. And he says, the free societies have beaten the unfree societies soundly. For 2,500 years, the ratio of casualties on the battlefield is about 10 to 1. Right. Because in the free societies, we look at the Canadians in Ortona, having this novel problem, how do you fight in a city? It's not in the battle manual. Right. Well, it's the sergeants and the lieutenants and even the privates who are working it out. And they're calling up the major or the colonel and saying, sir, we've got a way of doing this. And the colonel's saying, okay, you do that. Yeah. But this is not happening in other armies. Right. And the Soviets, I think it was Marshal Zhukov, explained that their solution to a minefield was just to charge through it, because they figured a bunch of guys would blow up the mines and then the rest of them could go. Right. Whereas in Western armies, there's a bunch of people saying, I think I've got a plan for blowing up the mines without blowing up myself. Right. I mean, the Soviets helped us win the war, but they wouldn't have won without us. They'd have lost. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, because you talked about that munitions, and I go back to that because when you said that was striking to what I see happening with COVID today, that the government doesn't want to have the discussion about what is defective in their policy. Like, there can't be dissent, there can't be any discussion at all. Just we'll keep using the faulty munitions. In this case, we'll continue to use the faulty policies. And if we don't have that healthy discussion, if we don't have that dissent, well, maybe we will end up like the Kaiser's army and instead of the British army.
Well, we've already, to some extent, there was another column in today's National Post about the fact that, you know, our record among developed countries is actually not good.
Yep.
Like, we can't even, it's not just we can't discuss why what we're doing isn't working, we can't even really talk about the fact that it's not working. But we've had terribly high death rates, and they've been very concentrated in vulnerable sectors of the population.
Yep.
And we have done huge damage to our economy. We have put government finances in a terribly perilous situation in order to fight what is largely a phantom. I'm not saying the disease isn't serious.
Yeah.
I'm not saying at the beginning it wasn't reasonable to say, what if it's the next bubonic plague? But we know now that for people who are under 70 with no underlying condition, it's not very dangerous. Whereas losing the restaurant you spent 20 years slaving to preserve and dreamt of handing on to your kids, or selling as your retirement fund, that's dangerous to your health. And there was another column in today's paper, and I hope he's right, but I think he's wrong. Randall Denley was saying, oh, Ontario is now going to fix the surgical backlog. But he had a number, I think it was 150,000 procedures have been delayed. Because we were clearing the decks so the ERs wouldn't get overwhelmed by COVID, which they didn't, but I don't think they were going to. However, even if it's reasonable to be afraid of it to begin with, now you've got to be able to say, but it didn't happen. And we were gonna flatten the curve. Now we're supposed to stop the second wave. Like, who ever heard of stopping a second wave of a disease? I'm not saying disease is good. I'd hope everybody lives to be 100. But you must understand what's possible and what's not. So we need to say, why are people who are not contagious wearing masks? Why? Because when you put all this effort into one thing that's pointless, you don't put effort into other things that might do better. Why were our seniors' homes so susceptible? We don't even really know how. I mean, my suspicion is that it got into the medical system, and then seniors often have problems that take them to hospital. They took it back to the homes. I don't know that, but I think that's probably
what happened.
Well, we know
that there was quite a number of people that were expedited out of the hospitals who were in what was in place in long-term care residence. We know that sick, elderly people who the hospitals wanted to make room for this potential surge. We also know that those individuals who exhibited symptoms of COVID, who were residents in long-term care, were not permitted to be admitted back into the hospitals. So it was a double whammy, I think, there. And there was a few other elements of our policies there that I think contributed to the tragedy in long-term care. Things like, all the Ontario physicians through the OMA had offered to put in physicians who had their practices closed up and weren't allowed to practice. They had offered to put physicians in the long-term care homes and do assessments and provide assessments and care, but that didn't happen. Shortly after we rejected the physicians, the OMA proposal, of course, the Canadian military was called in.
Right, and so why has nobody been fired over this? Why have no health ministers been dismissed? Again, as people can say, how can Patty Hedges still be the federal health minister? Her performance in a major health crisis has been appalling. And provincial ministers, I mean, maybe in some ways what you want to do is fire the previous minister, and you can't because they're already out of office. But yeah, we need to have a robust debate because, again, COVID's not the last disease we're ever going to get. No. So even, I'm not vindictive about this, but we need to assess our errors so we can fix them now, figure out who's in danger in the second wave. And again, I need to emphasize, it's not just who's in danger of getting COVID. It's who's in danger of losing their livelihood and seeing their hopes and dreams disappear. The slow motion suicides through despair. The children whose social connections are being devastated. Because we're trying to stop something that isn't probably going to happen anyway. We have to work through that, and we have to think, what about the next one? Why did we allow all these masks to be junked? Why did we send all this stuff to China? What were we thinking? And of course, the people who did it don't want you to say, oh, this is the time for that. And you can see them all when they put on the masks. They're so pleased with themselves. Hey, everybody, get with the program. There's a smugness about it, as opposed to saying, maybe we're all fools. Like when I see someone driving alone in a car with a mask, and I think to myself, you have actually gone mad, right? This is, what do you think you're going to get it from your steering wheel? It's so odd. And it prevents us from thinking intelligently about who is in danger and how do we protect them from all the things that are happening. Again, that 150,000 delayed surgeries. People are going to die of cancer, they're going to die of heart disease, they're going to die of kidney failure, they're going to die of all kinds of things, and you'll never see COVID on their certificate, but they died from an overreaction to COVID, and somebody made that decision.
Well, we know that, the data, the partial data is in, not only is there the 150,000 medical procedures that have been postponed and delayed, but we know between March and June of this year, we did 1,100 fewer cardiac surgeries than what we do every other year. We know we did about 200 fewer organ transplants between March and June. And, these are not cosmetic procedures. If you have an organ transplant or requiring cardiac surgery, it's because you need it. And typically, you need it sooner rather than later. And another one of the astonishing numbers that we saw, between March and June of this year, we did 5.6 million fewer diagnostic tests on people. So we didn't do the MRIs, we didn't do the blood tests, we didn't do the X-rays, the ECGs, the CAT scans, all these things that we need to, these are good and valuable tools for us to diagnose the health and diagnose what needs to be done. And they were just 6 million of them off the table.
Yeah, and this we could get off into a whole other subject because, of course, that means we don't detect the disease, so we don't treat it. That saves money, right? And in our healthcare system is set up so that treating patients is pure cost.
Yeah.
And whereas if you just quietly die cheaply, don't go running into the ER going, help, I'm dying. Just die quietly, and you're off the waiting list, so it gets shorter, and the global budget of the hospital is protected. The health budget overall doesn't rise as fast. We have a terrible health system. I can't believe Brian Day losing, though he's going to appeal, and more power to him. But there was so little comment about that. I think the NDP did a victory dance, and nobody else said anything about the fact, speaking of freedom, because Brian Day's fundamental point is that you have the right, as a human being living in a body without which you cannot live, to look after your health if the government won't do it. And in Canada, you're told no, because they stop the physicians from taking private practice, like outlaw, but they make the financial situation intolerable, and they forbid in many provinces the sale and purchase of insurance for things that are covered by the public system. So that if the government won't treat you, you just are meant to quietly to die. And it's amazing that Canadians who think we've got the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we're so big on personal integrity, the right to life, security of the person. And that was the grounds of his challenge, that you don't have the right, when the government won't operate on your heart condition, to buy insurance in this country from a willing seller and then go to a doctor willing to do the procedure and pay for it with this insurance. And we just think, but it's a team effort. Oh, and what we think is it's not going to be me, right? When it's you, it's like, what? How's that the rule?
Well, I think
then you're too old, you're too sick to fight.
One of the things that we've seen is through this haste and through that period of uncertainty and I would say even misinformation and unknowns back in March when we launched down this, one of the things that I was astonished is we never ever considered any of the consequences. We didn't consider the consequences. There was no discussion or debate about how this would impact access to medical attention and medical care. There was no discussion about how what this would do to the mental health and well-being of individuals who were lost gainful employment, who had their life's businesses and life savings put in jeopardy. There was just absolutely no consideration of those consequences, which we know are all powerful social determinants of health. And we're seeing a number of these consequences coming to play now. Not as well as obviously the financial considerations, but far more than just financial. But one of the things that bothers me is how and why the Western world just threw away all these fundamental freedoms threw away all these concepts of the rule of law, of accountability, of discussion and dissent. And we just threw them all away, and we embraced the mantra of the totalitarian regime of the Communist Chinese Party as the model that we should emulate to solve COVID.
Yeah, I know. You sound a bit odd talking like that, but of course we do have a prime minister who was asked before he was prime minister what government he admired, and he blurted out China because they could turn on a dime.
Yeah.
And that's part of the dream, is that, yeah, if we don't have all this silly old freedom like Parliament and question period and all this rhubarb, then the government can turn on a dime and fight COVID. It makes for efficient government. A la Mussolini makes the trains run on time. And it is odd because, again, when I used to teach American history, I would quote noted authority who called his country, a land perhaps the only one in the universe where freedom is the very end and purpose of the Constitution. That's not quite exact, and I'd say that, but that's pretty American sentiment, right? But actually, it's William Blackstone writing in 1765 about Britain. Yeah. Britain was so free that they didn't have compulsory elementary schooling until 1870. Right. Britain had no gun control at all in the 19th century. Zero gun control. At some point, they started requiring a license because they wanted 6 shillings or something, but there was in Sherlock Holmes' day, right? Yeah. Watson's just got a revolver. Nobody's saying fill it out. And yet they had fewer than 10 gun murders a year in London. Right. They were a free and a responsible people. And in those days, Britannia didn't just rule the waves. Yeah. British culture dominated the world. People like Charles Dickens. British products were the best. Right. Everybody looked to Britain with admiration, envy, or some odd mix of the two. And you see this, how is Britain able to stand alone against Hitler as late as 1940? But then after the war, the British very casually submit to rationing. Rationing goes on for 5 years after the war. Like, what? How dare you tell me I can't buy meat? But the British didn't object. And another thing that I think
for 5 years after the war.
I think it's 5 years, yeah. The Labour Party kept rationing because there were shortages, and they thought the solution to shortages isn't freedom and ingenuity, it's government mandates. Right. Just go and ask Uncle Joe, he'll tell you. Yeah. And at the worst part of the war, when they think the Germans are going to invade, and Churchill's cooked up the slogan they never had to use, which was, you can always take one with you, the government scrambled to hand out guns because they figured we're going to have to resist. Right. There were appeals to Americans, give a gun to a British home. And then as soon as the war is over, the British government said, we're going to take the guns back and we're no longer going to allow you to own a gun for self-defense. And the British said, okay. They didn't seem to mind. Yeah. And as a result, Britain fades as a global power. I don't just mean militarily, I mean culturally, economically. There's a lot of ruin in a nation, as Adam Smith said, but you still get the British invasion, the Beatles and the Who, and Britain still, they beat China in the Rio Olympics for the medal count, which is amazing. It takes a while, but they did give it up very easily, and so have Canadians. If you brought back Louis Saint Laurent today, and you told him the powers government wields, he would say, we lost the war. Right. He would not believe it. Louis Saint Laurent, he abhorred government intervention. Anything unnecessary was anathema to him. He was a very freedom-oriented kind of person. I don't think anybody in the politics of the 60s, even if they were socialists, they'd be, hey, how did we win? What happened to the resistance? And if they were a liberal, they'd say, what happened? Wilfrid Laurier, he would not recognize this country. Well, he would be appalled.
Let's restate that quote that you did from...
He said, Canada is free and freedom is its nationality. Right. And that was how he understood this nation and how he understood, he was a proud French Canadian, or as they were in those days, right, in Quebecois, but he understood that under British liberty, the people of Quebec had flourished in a way that the people of France had not been able to do under the Bourbons, or even this sort of chaos with Napoleon that you get afterward. That it was an amazing land of opportunity, and that is why we're so wealthy. It is why we're so formidable in the wars. It is why our culture is so lively and interesting. It's why people want to come here. Canada, like the United States, attracts people from all over the world because they think, where I am, I'm stuck. Someone's got their foot on my neck. Whether it's political or social, something is happening here and I can't breathe. But if I go to Canada, I can do what I want. I can be who I'm meant to be. I can raise my children with room for them to expand to the fullness of humanity. And yet, for all of that, we're sort of told, oh no, people come here for the welfare and the and multiculturalism, like your culture will be in a museum and you'll get to act in shows, as opposed to you'll get to choose the best that has been thought and done. I mean, again, I grew up in a Canada where British cooking was regarded with some enthusiasm, which is odd. But you know, and all kinds of people came here and said, well, we love a lot of things you do, but honest to goodness, I can't eat that. And so now we're, of course, eating a most amazing food because people could start a restaurant and say, don't eat what you're eating, eat what we're making. And you go, oh, this is amazing spices. I never knew they existed, you know. Is that, oh no, there's not garlic. But all of this, it is amazing now. In the opposition to Parliament, right? Justin Trudeau just sort of said, Parliament annoys me, and he'd come down the steps of the cottage and hand out $2 billion. And you want to say, who authorized that?
We saw that in Ontario as well. Where we have all the emergency powers of a state of emergency conferred to the Premier, who has delegated it to what's called the COVID command table, who we don't actually know who is there. We know that there's some bureaucrats, some experts, but we don't know who they are. We don't have the state of emergency anymore declared. That's been removed. But all the authority that is granted under an emergency rests continually, without debate, without vote. And that's again what allowed him to just make that edict last Saturday that the province is closed for. And these are astonishing that we've just said, well, I guess we're like Britain after the war. Let's ration freedom. Let's ration ourselves. The war's over. We've won, but we still don't want freedom.
Yeah, and the Labour Party won the 1945 election on the slogan "A land fit for heroes." But what they produced was a very depressing place. I mean, I was in Britain in the toward the late 70s, and it was just awful. It's actually a lot better since, because they partly recovered what they had once believed in. But yet we're much less happy people. We're much less dynamic people, and we're much less safe people if we're not free. Right. Because again, you look at Britain, like after the fall of France, what happened? The Prime Minister fell. They replaced him with Churchill. United States had elections during the war. And I remember Harry Truman, before he became vice president, he was a senator, and he was on a committee that was investigating waste in government, and he very nearly stumbled across the atomic bomb project because there was sort of money that was going in an odd direction, and they had to be taken aside and said, Senator, you're doing a great job, stop it, will you? but you see, they're in there, and he's in the governing party too, but he's poking around trying to see what the government's doing wrong. And whereas with us with COVID, where's the inquiry into why Ontario and Quebec, if they were independent nations, would rank way down on the table in terms of deaths, you know, like way up in the number per 100,000 people. Why did we get this? Don't use masks, do use masks, don't close the borders, do close the borders. Where's the investigation? Where's the determination? And, you know, this is going to take me back, as things will, to King Canute. You know, because everybody knows the story of King Canute, but they've all got it wrong. Like, Canute thought he could stop the waves, hardy har, what a chump, right? That's not the real story. The real story is that his courtiers were telling him he was so great and a favorite of God and marvelous and so on that he could even command the tides. And Canute said, gosh, as a devotee of evidence-based decision-making, I think I want to test that. Take my chair down at low tide in the mudflats, and I'll sit there, and the tide comes in, and he says, I command you to halt because I'm Canute, I'm so cool. And of course, salt water pours into his boots, and then he stands up and turns to his courtiers and he says, listen, you idiots, I'm the king, right? I get flattery morning, noon, and night for free. I don't need to pay you guys for it. You need to tell me what I'm doing wrong. You need to tell me what I can't do, because how else can I govern these people properly? And he said, never forget there's only one who can command the waves, and that's God. And the reason people told that story is that they wanted to remember, in the English-speaking world, even though he was a Danish interloper, he was an English king, rulers are humble. They are aware of their limitations. They will be told what they're doing wrong. And that's how we are going to maintain ourselves as a free, prosperous, and happy people. And so the last thing we need in a crisis is a ruler you can't tell they're wrong. And yet somehow we've forgotten that. We say, well, we'll criticize later when it's all okay. But in the meantime, don't upset the apple cart or whatever it is.
Well,
but
that is much
upsetting.
What I'm seeing in the legislature and in politics in general is, you know, the emperor has no clothes. And
his body is not a thing of beauty.
and you
wish that he did, please.
that's I don't want to see. But so this week in the legislature, I started off my question to the Premier with that it's time for us to be honest with the people of Ontario. And the Speaker cautioned me and said, I'm going to caution the member and make sure you use temperate and parliamentary language. And I thought, okay, well, this is odd. Asking somebody to be honest in their dealings generally has never before, in my time anyway, be seen as unparliamentary. But as we went through, I was cautioned further. And then my final question, I forget the exact words, but I've got it up on Facebook. But I had to withdraw my question about being honest and truthful with the people of Ontario about COVID. And then to further, and this was something again I've never seen in 13 years in the legislature, the Premier or his proxy refused to even acknowledge or answer the question in any fashion. Just
And of course,
Zero.
you know what this is going to do? It's going to take me back hundreds of years, right? Because there's a very famous episode in the British Parliament. It's the reason why the throne speech is given in the Senate, because they come down to the House of Commons and then the door is slammed in their faces. It goes back to 1642, when the king wants to grab 5 MPs who've been very strong critics. Charles I wants to get these guys. And he shows up in the House of Commons with armed men.
Right.
And he looks around and he realizes the 5 have been tipped off and they're gone. And he has the speaker dragged out of the chair. The king sits in the speaker's chair, and he says to William Lenthal, who was not widely regarded as a courageous man or anything, he says, "Where are those 5 MPs?" Right. And from his knees, the speaker, with a knife literally at his throat, the speaker responds, "If it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, except as the house whose servant I am commands me." Mm-hmm. And so that's the speaker's job, is to protect the legislator's right to question the executive against the king's prerogative. Right. And although, of course, by now in our system, the premier is always a member of the legislature, they're not acting primarily as a legislator, they're acting as the functioning head of the executive branch. Right. And it's the speaker's job to make sure that the legislators can control the executive. But people now don't think of it that way. They think it's a giant scrum with the orange, blue, and red teams all fighting for the prize, which is the premier's office. Yeah. And so the job of a legislator is to be a tile across which to step to the executive mansion. Yeah. And so the idea that the Liberal members, if it were a Liberal premier, might uphold the right of another party to call the premier to account, or that the Conservative members now might say, "Hey, yes, Your Majesty, get off your high horse, get out of the speaker's chair. Why are we not being honest?" Instead, it's like, "Oh, Randy Hillier is this he's not a team player. We're going to send him to Neptune without a helmet." A la Dilbert. But again, it's because they've forgotten what Parliament is for, how it's meant to work, why we have a Parliament, what would happen if we didn't. And one of the things that would happen if we didn't is the king would just spend money recklessly, and then he would tax us until our bones rattled in our skin. Yeah. And that's why there's Magna Carta.
And control. That's one of the fundamental, what I see anyway, is one of the purposes of government. And this is not said in a negative fashion, but it is control. In our case, there to help ensure peace, order, and good government. So that it conveys some level of control. I don't think anybody understood that, or when they were writing that peace, order, good government, and no freedom.
Well, no, they understood the paradox. You need a government strong enough to protect your liberty, but not strong enough to threaten it. Right. And that this is the problem through most of history. I mean, anarchy is when it's not strong enough to protect it. Yeah. But the main problem is it's too strong and it threatens it itself. Right. And the men who made Confederation knew their British history inside and out. They would have known about William Lenthal. These stories would not have been a surprise to them. And they knew we must make a government that can defend people against force and fraud, internal and from outside, but cannot itself jeopardize their liberties. And that's why there are all these checks and balances, all these provisions about what the executive cannot do. And I've been having a very interesting discussion online. I actually had a productive Twitter conversation, which is like, no,
that does
can't
not very
be.
often.
But it was about there's a provision in our Constitution that says that the Parliament cannot appropriate money except for a purpose recommended by a message by the Governor General. And the people I was debating with were saying the main reason for this is that the legislature doesn't just run amok and spend. And I think they're actually don't have a very good point. But I maintain that it's also so that the executive can't just steamroll the legislators with one measure after another. And I will say that people who seem to know what they were talking about said I was wrong. So I'm not sure how ironclad a constitutional thing this is, but the throne speech exists for a reason. And it exists so that the legislators will know what is coming and can prepare for it. And I don't mean prepare to go, rah, rah, you're the best, pass it. So that they can ask, is it a good idea? And again, if nothing is happening and the government's spending money on daffodils, you're thinking, well, okay, it doesn't really matter if we have question period or not. But when you've got a war or an epidemic or something really major happening, and the government has making plans that if they work may save us from something terrible, but if they fail may either let something terrible happen or else actually independently cause something terrible. This is when you need this whole panoply of freedoms and refusals to bow to the king. And that thing with the throne speech, when they come and say the king would like to speak to you and the door is slammed in his face. This is to say, no, you may be the king, but that's no big deal to us. We are the parliament and we are the representatives of the people. We're the only branch that directly represents people. In a parliamentary system, we're the only branch that's directly chosen. The judges aren't, and you don't get to be a minister because you were elected Minister of Finance. And we have important privileges because we know that pride and vanity and a kind of overweening ambition to do good will lead government to abuse its powers and its citizens if they're not prevented from doing it. This is a universal lesson of history.
I think that is a powerful message. It is to do good, but it's well, as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions as well.
Yeah, even one of the problems in Rome, right, where the Republic was falling apart, right? I wouldn't have known how to put it back together, but Augustus is the first emperor, and he gets all this power, and he uses it really well. And people go, oh, I guess it's okay to have an emperor. And then you get Tiberius, who is also a good emperor, and also sort of a bit of a cynical character, a pessimist, so he doesn't expect miracles. But when you get someone like Caligula or Nero, all you can think of is you better get a better emperor. You can't think we need a structure of government that restrains it. Although, even there, Rome has this rule of law. And there's a story, of course, about the Apostle Paul, when they've got hold of him, and he's just a troublemaker, and he won't shut up, and so on. And for the good, we're just going to pound this guy. And he goes, is that what you do to Roman citizens? And the guy with the scourge goes, you're a Roman citizen? Okay, and they put away the torture instruments, and they're like, oh no, now what do we do? And finally they send him to Rome, and because you had rights. They understood we can't just have arbitrary government. Otherwise, we will govern badly. And that was a critical insight, again, that we seem to have lost. If Justin Trudeau has ultimate power, and he's a swell guy with great socks, nothing bad can happen. But Ludwig van Mises was a great libertarian economist. I think it was van Mises was asked, well, if you were made dictator, what would you do? And he said, I'd abdicate. and said, you couldn't trust me with that power. I'm not saying like it's because they're inferior human beings. If they were, we could just elect better emperors or something. Or God could give us better emperors. Nobody can be trusted. But you see how much fun they're having, right? They're saving us all. The politicians, I mean, the ones in power, the premiers and the prime ministers and the health ministers and so on, they've never been more important in their lives. They never will be more important, and it feels good. And I understand it feels good. I'd love to be that important, but don't give me that power. Don't.
Like that was obvious from very early on in this. People were asking me about, why are we still doing this? I said, well, listen, I said, if you're an elected leader, this is utopia. They can come out once a day at the magic hour, be showered with applause and attention, and be adored without any accountability. And I said, why would they not want to keep doing this?
Yeah, and plucking fruit from the magic money tree and throwing it out, right?
Yeah.
What, a $343 billion deficit, and they just say, oh, no more interest rates are low.
Yeah.
It's like, I sure hope when you were a teacher, you weren't teaching economics. But yeah, exactly. There's the adulation, and I mean, it's a danger in politics. I was briefly in politics, and I was I was a staffer, and I was, it wasn't a happy experience. But I remember one of the things I noticed was even an opposition MP, everybody's always trying to get their attention, get their time. They're super important.
Yeah.
What did the boss say? You get him on the phone. Can I get him on the phone? No, 10 other people want him on the phone. Everybody wants you all the time, and you start to think, I'm great.
Yeah.
And you say, no, there's something actually wrong with the structure and why all this is happening. Yeah. But I don't know how close we are to wrapping up, so I want to mention something about freedom, because you got a picture of Thomas Jefferson, which I think might be in the picture.
Yeah.
And I
also have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights in my office.
Well, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms Section 1 is a real bummer, but people can watch my documentary on that.
Perfection is...
no, it's a long way from perfection.
That's right.
Because the Section 1 says you don't have these rights if we don't want to give them to you, right?
Yeah.
That's a terrible clause. That's what happened with Brian Day. The court said, yeah, sure, it's a violation if there's a right to security of the person, but hoo-ha, right?
Yeah, the rest of the charter is pretty good, but that
Section 1 is lethal.
Yeah.
But the thing about Jefferson, and I regard Jefferson as a villain, a real villain. And the worst thing about Jefferson is his policy on race. And I've been saying this since before Black Lives Matter, so I can prove it. I've got recordings. Although Jefferson talked about liberty and the dignity of the individual, spoke marvelously, was a brilliant man, he was a vile hypocrite on slavery, not just in having a slave mistress, but in that he would not give freedom to his fellows, and partly it was just on expedient grounds toward the end of his life. There's a famous episode where Edward Coles, a very wealthy Virginian, he's got lots of slaves, and he goes to Jefferson and says, I propose that we both free our slaves. Because people notice if I do it, because I'm rich and people say giving up money. But who am I? Who's heard of Edward Coles? You're Thomas Jefferson. You wrote the Declaration of Independence. You founded the University of Virginia. You were president. This can put slavery on the road to extinction. And Jefferson said no. And you know what Coles did? He freed his slaves anyway, took them to the north, became governor of Illinois. If Jefferson had freed his slaves, I don't know what, his reckoning in the next world would have been a lot easier, I'm sure. There would have been no Civil War. Look what happened to the United States because it didn't live up to its ideals of freedom. This ought to be a searing warning that even the best among us can go wrong when we praise freedom in theory, but in practice we say, I don't see how it's going to work, let's not do it.
I wasn't aware of that story, John.
Well, it's an amazing story because Coles proves that you can do it, and Jefferson proves that you can sure do things wrong.
But this, that's interesting because it speaks to one of my fundamental beliefs. That and Jefferson's words were powerful. Like the Declaration of Independence. There's no doubt that he had a lot of marvelous qualities, but the actions are much more profound than the words.
Yeah, that's the thing. He has so many marvelous qualities. What's his excuse? Right? If he'd been some sort of a third-rate bum, slave owner, Simon Legree, but he wasn't. He did know better. And I don't know how deep into this we want to get, but his slave mistress was, we're almost certain, his wife's half-sister. So if you were attracted to the same qualities in Sally Hemings as you were in many respects in your wife, how do you not see that all men are created equal when you yourself said it? It's a terrible thing. And Jefferson, I have other complaints about Jefferson. His foreign policy, again, sounded good, but was not sensible. And he sided with revolutionary France against Free Britain. What an incredible thing to have done. But at any event, we just want to talk about
we
what
will
happens
have to
when
have
you
a
don't.
Conversation about some of those other aspects.
Okay, but I'm knowing the danger of giving up freedom for expediency. When you know what's right and you don't do it, there are enormously damaging practical consequences, and that brings us back to COVID to saying surrendering our freedom isn't going to let us beat the disease.
No,
it's going to let the disease beat us. And so from the purely utilitarian practical, we don't want to get this disease thing, we've got to get back to questioning the authorities before they question you.
Well, listen, I'm going to, the only other illustration that I can think of where a free society, a democracy, a society with the rule of law that willingly gave up those things, those freedoms, that we're talking about. The only one that comes to my mind that is really striking is after with Nazi Germany. You know, it was an elected, what do they call it? The Reichstag.
Reichstag, yeah. It was at the time.
And Hitler gets a minority government, and soon, within years, people have lost their freedoms. They've lost their liberties. If you pray in a synagogue, you better start looking over your shoulder. Your property is starting to be vandalized. And if you're a Roma ethnicity, same thing. Or all these, but he was adored in Germany. You know, the person doing this was adored. And they kept saying, yes, you can have all this authority. And you're going to do good with it.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, Germany is one of those countries that was half in and half out. You know, Germany doesn't have a tradition of freedom. There's no German Magna Carta. Yeah. You know, the Kaiser had a parliament, but it didn't amount to much. And so the Germans made a very, I mean, not all of them, but, more than didn't, made a fatal choice in a situation where freedom was not instinctive with them. Right. And you the same thing with the Italians and Mussolini. It wasn't as though they went from, Britain under William III to Mussolini. But again, Britain, tarnished, and Canada too, as we've given up our freedoms over the last 60 years, we haven't gone fascist or anything, but are we a happier, more prosperous, more positive place than we used to be? And again, the American example where what Barack Obama called their original sin, right? America is born free. It really is a nation devoted to liberty. The Declaration of Independence really does send shivers up your spine, or ought to, but they didn't extend it to Black Americans, and they paid a horrendous price that they're still paying. Yeah. So everywhere you look, when people have a choice between freedom and unfreedom, the choosing unfreedom is a terrible mistake. It's a moral mistake. It's a practical mistake. Right. The chickens come home to roost in dreadful ways. And so there's it seems to me that you should understand, I would choose freedom even if it were not practical, because it's essential to human dignity. But it turns out that the universe is so constructed that it is both metaphysically right and practically right. And if it is, why would you possibly start sacrificing it when you're in a tight corner? Yeah. It's like, this is no time to panic, because panic impedes the functioning of your brain. Well, restrictions on freedom impede the functioning of your brain. You can't think clearly. What's the problem? Who's doing it right? Who's doing it wrong? What are they doing over there? If every time, even if it's not like jackboots and truncheons, but when you try and speak up, people say, oh, shut up, get with the program, and they all laugh at you, then people aren't thinking to themselves. I remember there was a very funny thing online, a conversation between the mask advocate and the mask opponent, where the mask opponent keeps saying, well, if I'm coughing and sneezing, I shouldn't be out anyway, and so on. Like, what's the mask doing? But at the end, the line is, just shut up. And that means you don't think things through properly.
Well, that's been a real, it's been obvious to me throughout this whole COVID thing. The population has become so polarized with COVID. Like there is no room for any discussion. There's certainly no room for dissent, and just how no society, no person has ever gotten out of a problem or has become better without criticism, without dissent, without discussion. The polarization is just extreme. And you did mention one other thing that I think, which again I've seen here, is through all this COVID, 7 months now, it's been pretty obvious to me that people aren't as happy. We're seeing far greater examples in numbers of people wanting to snitch on others and say, well, I saw my neighbor talking to their neighbor and they weren't 6 feet apart, and all these different things, which are not that they didn't exist before, but the frequency and the quantity of complaints that I see, in stories of customers accosting other customers if they're not obeying the proper distancing laws and different things. And well, this is not Canada. This is not what I grew up in.
Yeah, well, I know people are frightened. A lot of them are afraid. You know, their livelihood is trickling away. Their future. If suppose you're elderly and you don't know how many years you got left, you can't see your grandkids. And it's an interesting thing because when I go to a store, you know, and I put on the mask and I observe the distancing, because I'm not convinced that the risk is nearly as high as people think, but I'm convinced that if I don't do that, I'm going to frighten people who are already on edge. And this seems to me to be a mean thing to do. And then I find myself, when I see someone who's not doing it, I start getting annoyed. And I'm thinking, wow, that's an amazing reaction. But part of it's not because I think you're going to make me sick, but I think you're going to make everybody uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And why do you want to do that? But the answer, of course, we only have so much goodwill and compassion, right? It's all, you know, you read the Gospels, you think, okay, well, that's how I should be. But then you read St. Paul and he says, that which I would do, I do not, and that which I would not do, I do. And you realize, you know, we're all working with limited resources of moral strength here. Let's try to make it easier for one another and create an atmosphere. This isn't just there, but in all kinds of ways. I had a debate with somebody on Twitter in the spring about, I mean, this was an academic whose Twitter feed was full of F-bombs. And I was saying, don't do that, right? Like, this is a problem. And he said, well, it's not like I'm lying. And I said, you know what? A foul mouth proceeds from a foul mind as a false mouth does from a false mind. So he blocked me. I was like, if he can't say the F word all over the place, he just excludes me from the universe. Like, that was, and I thought that's such a characteristic reaction. And it's easy to get mad on Twitter. But again, you sort of have to examine the state of your soul before you can examine your state as a citizen and think, am I helping or am I making the problem worse here? And because you know, people say things, you're like, that's the most infuriating nonsense. You're deliberately being stupid at me. And you think, no, this person's not stupid and they're not evil. And so let's try to deal with their mistake in a way. And also, I wish people would remember Dale Carnegie's advice. There's a lot of corn in Dale Carnegie, but there's some kernels of wisdom. And he says, if you tell somebody you're an idiot because, you're never going to convince them of what you say next. And we're all like, oh, I feel good because I called him an idiot. But again, why do I feel good calling someone an idiot? If they're not, I'm an idiot. And if they are, it's kind of harsh because like, oh, no, I'm an idiot and he said so. I think that it's not specific to COVID or anything else, that there's just a kind of a surly assertion of the will. And I think part of it, again, this would take us in a whole other direction, but the loss of faith. Because as long as you think there's a perfect God who loves you, but wants you not to be such a jerk, then that changes how you interact with other people versus when you're told you're the best, every impulse you have is wonderful, anybody who frustrates your impulses ought to be swept aside. Then we don't interact in a civil way with one another. And I think we really need to, the whole tone of debate, and ours first, right? You know, beware of the beam in your own eye before you have to the mote in the other person's. Which again, people will say, "What? I've read your columns. You're just a hypocrite. There, you're completely ferocious." Yeah, okay. So I'm a sinner, but that's. But at least I have some idea of it. And so again, with COVID, to be try to lower the tone and talk partly about trade-offs and say, you know, I'm not like trying to exterminate the human race or foment armed revolution, but I want to think about, well, what are the costs and benefits of doing this? What are the costs and benefits of doing that? Can you tell me how you see this? And then you could say, well, I'm concerned that you're not counting the cost enough. Again, because you're talking about the kind of feeling of helplessness and despair. And you know, people who work for government, it's less of a problem by a long shot.
For sure.
But they should understand they don't know how the other half lives. All the people in the the bottom half of the private sector, most people working in the gig economy, the people who are working retail, the people who are cutting hair. Do you understand what it's like to sit around day after day having this happen and being unable to do anything about it?
Being unable. That's, and you're just the victim of somebody else's decisions and with little influence or no influence.
Yeah, and then the public sector goes on strike for more money. And you're thinking, this really isn't a good moment, right? Like, how can you do that now? How do you have such a sense of grievance that you don't see the pain opposite? I it was extraordinary that teachers kept pushing for more money in Ontario with the COVID thing when they're already better paid than most people. And they've got these pensions, again, with Trudeau and his $343 billion deficit. He doesn't understand the unfunded pension liability problem in the public sector, and the government doesn't want to hear about it. But it's very real, and this makes it worse. So there's all kinds of things that we need to be able to talk about without starting to call each other dirty names.
One of the things that I would say is many of the, and I think this is unwittingly, I don't know if this is for certain, but I see that this way. The government has kept promoting new initiatives, new restrictions, new requirements, new mandates, in some sort of fashion to appease that number of people in the public who are fearful, who are in panic, who, and it, for many people, it's extreme panic and extreme fear. And I think the masks are a good example of that, where to appease this fear, let's make everybody wear masks, without understanding, because when we brought in the masks, we had no cases whatsoever in this area, in most areas. There was no evidence of any community spread, very few illnesses. And then it just ramped up the fear once again. After that fear was finally starting to temper and diminish a little bit. But there was people clamoring. And government responded without understanding, well, okay, we've just put ourselves back in another pickle here. But I think that goes back to that, we were not allowed to have a discussion or debate about those mandatory mask rules. Consequences aren't important. Discussion, debate are not important. Looking at the cost benefit, none of that was important.
I mean, even am I wearing a mask so I won't get sick or so you won't get sick? Because if I'm wearing a mask so you won't get sick, I'm not sick. So what am I doing here? And if I'm wearing it so you won't make me sick, I don't think you're going to make me sick. I don't even think you're sick. So I mean, and maybe I would have that discussion in the end. I'd say, okay, I better wear a mask. But as you say, we never had the discussion. We never talked about who should be wearing a mask, and we never. Again, if you look at the statistics, right, of who is dying of COVID. It's people over 70 who already have a medical problem. What are we doing to make sure they, in particular, are protected? Instead of just going all around saying, "I've got a mask, I've got a pretty mask, I've got a novelty mask, I've got a mask that shows my face." And one of the things that I think is going on here, and I think it's partly why we don't insist on having a debate, that I'm increasingly of the view that there's been a decline in courage in our society, that people have gradually become timid. And when you look at what are we teaching children with the, they're teaching you ready to weld. And I mentioned before we started the discussion, I was in elementary school and they're getting the kids back to school, and there's a police officer who's wearing a mask, carrying a sidearm, a taser, and pepper spray. And nobody thinks this is a strange thing when you're getting grade 3s to line up. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe some of the parents are going to, get a whiff of pepper and earn it. But we no longer think it's odd. I was watching years ago, on campus at the University of Ottawa, police directing traffic with flak vests and vests and automatic pistols. And I'm thinking, what do you think? What's this about? And why aren't we bothered? And if we're bothered, why don't we say, "Excuse me, officer, you don't need that here." Like, the worst thing that's going to happen is somebody in a bicycle is going to cut a corner, right? You're not going to shoot them. At least I hope you're not going to shoot them. But I don't like your gun. But it's like, oh no, I can't say that. I might get arrested. But in all kinds of ways, I do think there's been people are always erring on the side of caution. And of course, the thing is that's actually dangerous. That's the paradox. That we are so worried about COVID. Like, we treat it like getting COVID is now like going to hell, right? It's like it's so bad that anything is worth doing so you don't go to hell. That all the other risks that we're running without even knowing we're running them. Like, what happens if governments become insolvent? What happens if some of the provinces that were already in a financial stew can't meet their bills, and they come to the feds and say, "We can't pay our bills," and the feds say, "No problem, Justin Trudeau has all the money in the universe."
With Newfoundland and Labrador, the government had to backstop their bonds back in April of $30 billion.
And has it gotten better since? And now that they go, the Bank of Canada can just buy them all. But then suppose that somebody, it's a bit of the emperor having no clothes, when someone suddenly goes, "You know what? The federal government doesn't have that money either." Something really bad could happen to us, and it would happen because we thought we were playing it safe, and we were running an appalling risk in a direction we just weren't looking. And so one of the things you need courage to do is face reality. The first thing, it's like when you go to the doctor's office and you say, "I'm not feeling well," and you say, "Doc, tell me the truth.
Yes.
And the doctor gives you some ghastly diagnosis. You say, Doc, I didn't mean that, right? Like, tell me a fairy tale now. But of course, it's first you got to know, am I sick? Am I healthy, right? What's going on here? It's like, well, the question with the religion, like, is there or isn't there a God? You don't start with, do I want there to be a God? That's got nothing to do with it. You say, is there or isn't there? That's the really important question. When you're shown the 10 Commandments, like, is it really true that God said that? Because if he did, I better wash out my mouth with soap and promise to do better. If not, it's just a bunch of silly Hebrew written on a rock. But it takes courage. It takes a lot of courage. And courage, like with the governors, to say, I'm feeling so great today. Could someone tell me why I shouldn't?
Right.
Like, would someone please tell me what I bungled? Because you know that feeling in life when you suddenly realize you've done something important that's just mind-bogglingly bad and stupid. And the first thing you try to do is convince yourself that it didn't happen, that it wasn't like it looks, or you didn't do it, or I'm going to find some way out of this. But then at some point you just say, no. It was me.
Yeah.
And I see this when politicians get caught in embarrassing situations. One of the things they're very poor at doing is owning it, going in front of the camera and saying, I did it, it was wrong, it's my fault, and I'm sorry. Yeah. And they'll say, but of course, don't but of course me. No.
And I think that that really is the crux of the matter that we have, there was errors. You know, like, I'm pretty confident saying that there was errors. And I'm pretty confident saying that government knows that there was errors. But they don't want to admit that there was errors. And they'd rather, let's just not talk about that. Let's, Harry, like your story with Harry, just go away and on to something else. And we've seen that. We know this is to be true. You know, when we see a government apologize for a past sin, the past sin is usually way off in the past. The apology for the internment of the Japanese in the Second World War. What was that, 50 years later? The apology for the residential schools. You know, governments don't mind apologizing for some other government long in the past, but there is an absolute rejection of the idea that we should apologize for our actions today.
Yeah, I remember when Tony Blair was apologizing for the Irish potato famine or something, and Florence King had wrote, words cannot express how much I regret the annexation of Schleswig-Holstein, right? And I remember when I was teaching a seminar at UVO on slavery, and I said to the students, we all think that if we lived in 1850, we'd have been abolitionists. Yeah. But statistically, it's not true. You'd have had a couple of, fire-breathing slavery advocates in the room. You had a couple of abolitionists and a bunch of people who didn't want to hear about it. Right. And I said, what we should learn from that is that there are probably things in our own time that posterity will regard with equal horror.
Yeah.
But it's so hard to imagine. What could we be doing as wrong as people were in those days with slavery? And so I said, well, what about abortion? Yeah. And one of the students said, what about the rights of animals? Yeah. And so we had two very different, but it was illuminating to think about. Yeah. What might they wonder? How could you have done this? Because once you start to think like that, to think, suppose I'm not perfect. Yeah. Suppose everything I do isn't marvelous. Yeah. Suppose all of history wasn't so I could come along. Then what might they say? How did you surrender your freedom without a struggle? Yeah. How could it be? Like with the Germans, right? Yeah. People say, why didn't you fight Hitler? Yeah. And they're sitting there thinking, you know what? I don't know why I didn't fight Hitler. Like, I really, honestly, I feel so, like such an idiot here. I don't know why I didn't fight Hitler.
Well, I think it goes back to the lack of courage, and I think freedom builds courage. And I would say to you, John, that the absence of freedom creates timidity.
You get to blame things on someone else, whether it's the bosses or the mob or anything, as opposed to saying, I made a decision. And I know with some Soviet defectors, apparently, when they came to the West, having been told that freedom was great, they found that actually having to take responsibility for things in your life was a real challenge. Yeah. Because they'd been used to being miserable, but it being the government's fault. Right. And there was a certain comfort in that. Like, nothing that's wrong was me. Yeah. And in a free society, I do agree, because it's like going to the gym, you can do more push-ups because you did push-ups. The more you take it upon yourself to say, this is what I'm going to do in this decision. I've thought about it. I've got all the information I'm going to have. I know I might be blundering, but I'm going to do this. You acquire the habit of taking things on and saying, for better or worse, this is my judgment at this moment, and of saying, oops, I messed that one up.
Yeah.
And that's important too. You get into the habit of saying, okay, that was bad, I cut my losses. And again, entrepreneurs have to do that. We thought they'd like this soup, but they didn't. We're going to bankrupt the restaurant. We have to admit the soup is terrible. But in government, it's like the soup needs a subsidy because you don't have that pressure. But in your own life, there are just things like, being a parent is one of the nightmares because you draw a line with your kid and then you have a confrontation with your kid. And then you think to yourself, I drew that line in the wrong place. The kid's actually right. How do I get out of this without losing all authority and credibility? And of course, the answer is, like I was told when I started teaching, and a professor said to me, the most important thing you can ever tell a student is, I don't know. Because if they ask you a question and you don't know, and you bluff and they catch you, you lose all respect. But if you say, I don't know, they realize that you're going to be honest with them, even when being a doctor, professor, you should know everything. Well, I think it's the same with kids. If you say to the kid, you know what, when I told you you had to do this or else, I shouldn't have said that. It was a mistake on my part. Here's what you should actually do. This takes courage to do, but as you do it, you get more courage. And again, with politicians, how many politicians who got caught in a minor scandal made it so much worse because they couldn't just come out and say, the reason I did that was that I was arrogant and stupid and full of myself, and this is how it happened, and it was wrong, and here's what was wrong, and now I won't do it again. It'd be so easy in so many cases to put out even a series like Watergate. If Nixon had said, you know, we were sitting around hating our opponents during an election, and I growled out some sinister phrase that somebody heard me say, who will rid me of this turbulent priest, and they went and did it. But it's not his fault, because I'm the president and I said it. And that's how it happened. So I'm pardoning him, and you can either get rid of me or say Richard Nixon owned up to a real boneheaded move and move on. If he'd done that, he would not have had to resign. But he couldn't. And they dug the hole deeper and deeper because they were afraid of assuming responsibility for an error.
Well, listen, John, it is always marvelous chatting with you. I hope people who are watching enjoy the conversation as well.
I hope so. If you did, climatediscussionnexus.com, look at our videos, read the blog items, make a donation because we're crowdfunded.
So maybe just to end off, I don't know about the climate Nexus discussion.
Climate Discussion Nexus. What we do, we publish a weekly newsletter, and it links to items on the blog where we talk about news, opinion, and science to do with climate change. We also put out videos. We did one on the supposed 97% scientific consensus that's had, I think, 700,000 views on YouTube. Because people are hungry for the truth. That's another thing that gives a real cause for hope on this or any area. People want the truth. They know they need it. It's like eating junk food versus eating real food. And so the newsletter is free, the videos are free, but we are crowdfunded. You know, people say, oh, aren't you getting oil company money? And my answer is not nearly enough of it. We probably do get some. There's a firewall. But the thing is that if people believe they're destroying the planet, they shouldn't be in that business. And if they don't believe they're destroying the planet, they ought to stand up for themselves and their way of life and say, no, the science is wrong. Because if you try and concede the science and fight on the policy, I call this, it's an old goon show gag about rallying around the white flag. Never works, right? Policy's probably right, but the science isn't right. So much that gets said is absolute nonsense. And again, you know, they all move away from you there on the bench when you say, well, I'm a global warming denier. But it's not true what you're being told, and so I'm going to get out there and say it. And let the chips fall where they may, because again, the damage we could do to ourselves, the real damage, because of an imaginary problem. And that man-made global warming is a largely imaginary problem. Humans may have caused some small increase in temperature in the last 50 years. I think most skeptics probably think there's been a bit more than I do. But most of it's a natural warming coming out of the Little Ice Age. CO2 has very little to do with global temperature. And we're going to stampede like lemmings into wrecking our economy. Look at the throne speech. What did they say about the fossil fuel sector? Like we could split the country, we could crush the economy, we could, you know, destroy our export industry, we could bankrupt, well, can't bankrupt the government, so Western governments could become insolvent, a technical point. On all of this, because we think that plant food is pollution. And that's a bit silly. And so a lot of my time is now spent saying this is very silly, and I hope people come over and see why.
Well, listen. Be courageous in continuing to speak out, and pleasure chatting here. And we'll look forward to chatting another day. Thank you.